but only on the team that matches their biological sex at birth. So let's go to Jan Crawford, our chief legal correspondent, who's been reading through this ruling. Jan, good morning. How did they rule and on what grounds?
Well, the justices in a ruling by Justice Brett Kavanaugh are saying that states can ban transgender athletes from participating in women's sports. They're saying that these state laws, you mentioned there are 27 of them, more than half of the states have these kind of bans, that they don't violate the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, and they do not violate Title IX, that landmark 1972 law that really leveled the playing field for girls' sports. They're saying that these states have rational reasons for wanting to have girls and boys sports teams, and that states feel free to create those teams, draw those lines however they want to draw them, including based on someone's biological sex. So this means that those state laws that now ban transgender participation will remain in place. There are 2 other states that do it by policy, so a total of 29 actual bans, while other states, it appears from this ruling, can continue to proceed like they always have. If they want to allow it, then they're free to go ahead and allow that kind of participation. That would be exactly how the court handled its last major transgender rights case, when last year it left it up to the states to decide whether or not they're going to ban puberty blockers and hormone treatments for minors. Now, this case appears to be focused very much on sports. Justice Kavanaugh talking about why states may want to have male and female sports, the differences in the biology of girls and boys, and potentially safety reasons. It's very focused on sports, which means it doesn't resolve the broader issues about transgender rights. For example, the status on a passport or military participation. The court is also not deciding exactly how it wants to treat transgender rights in terms of their constitutional status. Are they going to subject it to kind of a heightened discrimination like they would racial discrimination, for example? They're saving those issues, those very big issues, for another day. But again, a major ruling, Tony, on an incredibly contentious issue that has divided the states across this country and our politics. Whether transgender athletes can participate in girls' sports, whether states can ban them from participating in girls' sports. Today, the court is saying yes, states are free to do that under the Constitution and under federal law. Tony.
All right, Jan, thank you very much. Let's bring in Jessica Levinson, a CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor. And Jessica, I'll just read a quote here from the opinion by Justice Kavanaugh. He writes, "The states argue and the court agrees that the interest of safety and competitive fairness are important interests for the purpose of equal protection, and the state's sex-based classification limiting women's and girls' sports to biological females is substantially related to those interests." Your reaction to the ruling today?
So my reaction is what the court is doing is fairly predictable. What they're looking at is their Equal Protection Clause case law that applies based on sex-based discrimination. And they're saying that these types of laws satisfy that level of scrutiny. So they're looking at what West Virginia is doing, what Idaho is doing, prohibiting transgender people from participating on girls' and women's sports. And they're saying, is that okay under the constitutional framework that we've created? And then they're going through that Equal Protection Clause analysis and saying, yes, it is okay. Essentially, as Jan said, this is something that the states constitutionally can do. And as you just discussed with Jan, this is something that under that landmark piece of legislation, Title IX, states are also free to do. It's interesting the court is consolidating the 2 cases, answering both questions at once.
All right, Jessica, thank you. Let's turn to Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett. Major, as Jan mentioned, this has been a hot-button social issue, something that's in the political bloodstream, the rights of transgender people in general, and in particular, the participation of transgender girls in high school and in college sports. How do you think this will be processed politically?
Well, during the 2024 campaign, Tony, as you and our audience well remember, this was an issue raised by Republicans, raised by Donald Trump against Democrats and Kamala Harris in specific, and it cut very aggressively against Democrats and the Kamala Harris campaign. President Trump, early in his second term, very extravagantly signed executive orders in this space to protect women's sports for women only and girls. One of the underlying questions here, Tony, is does transgenderism mean you are trying to seek by being transgender a competitive sports advantage? Or are you transgender because you want to be and later in life decide to participate in sports? Well, just because you've become transgender, does that mean you've given up any of your access to sports with your chosen new identity? Well, the court is wrestling with this. And the court said in its syllabus, this is still subject to scientific and medical debate, all of these issues related to transgenderism. But right now, the court is saying states have a valid and rational interest to put some limits, some protections for safety and competitive fairness in the legal code. But the court is acknowledging something that we should remind ourselves. This is an evolving debate. Right now, it is in a very definite hesitant towards transgender rights space. I would just remind our audience, there was a time in our country in the late 1990s and early 2000s when many states, most states in our countries, constitutionally banned same-sex marriage. We are in a different place on that issue now. That debate and all the human rights issues underneath that evolved over time. I'm not predicting that for transgenderism, but I'm saying that is something that our country went through on an issue that seemed to be, in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, settled. And it became unsettled because the Supreme Court and a cultural reevaluation of what same-sex marriage means in this country. We might see that in transgender space. We're not seeing it now, and the court is giving states latitude to impose some limits to protect those engaged in sports right now from a perceived threat of competitive imbalance or unfairness in that space.
All right, Major, thank you. Let's go to senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, who joins us now. Ed, I imagine the president's going to take in this opinion and probably do a little bit of a political celebration today.
It will be. This is an issue, as Major mentioned, that was a galvanizing force for his election in 2024 and something he talks about on almost a regular basis, and that is a legislative push to try to ban conversion therapy or federal funding that might go to it in some way, and also talks openly about, in essence, getting the Supreme Court to where it got today, allowing the states to decide for themselves what exactly should be done about student athletes. We are awaiting a handful of the final rulings today. This one, of course, and then, of course, a decision on his attempt to undo birthright citizenship as a constitutional right, and then one other political coordination case that could ultimately be of benefit to Republicans, at least in this campaign cycle. So a big day for the White House to be watching for here, as we know that right now justices are still reading through this first opinion as we await the response in the next one. The president, for a while, has been channeling that he anticipates losing on the birthright citizenship case, but between this decision on transgender athletes and the handful of decisions yesterday regarding presidential power, they're ending the Supreme Court term here at the White House relatively pleased and, as expected, expanding presidential powers in terms of allowing him to fire heads of independent agencies, and then in this case going as expected and allowing states to determine for themselves what to do about transgender athletes. Tony.
Ed, thank you very much. I want to go back to our chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford. Jan, with the benefit of just a few more minutes to read through the ruling, any more takeaways?
Yes, I mean, there's a pretty sharp dissent from the liberal justices. Justice Sonia Sotomayor is now reading aloud parts of that dissent from the bench. And also, as we were talking about, what does it mean for states that currently allow transgender athletes to participate in sports like California and New York? The court, again, as we discussed, making clear that this ruling is not affecting those states. They are not ruling on that issue. There's going to be some legal challenges, I'm sure, ahead to those states and how they're handling it. But right now, the court is simply saying that states that want to ban transgender participation in girls' sports can do that under the Constitution and under federal law.
Jan, for the benefit of our audience here, what's the significance of Justice Sotomayor reading aloud her dissent from the bench?
It's something that the justices say when they feel very strongly about an issue. And we've seen these liberal justices feel pretty strongly about a lot of these cases. We've seen a lot of dissents being summarized from the bench recently. But historically, that's your signal that the justice wants you to listen and to pay attention to what they're saying in the dissent, because they believe what they have to say is so important, and they're registering their strong disagreement with what the majority is doing, Tony.
All right, Jan, thank you very much. And a note to our audience, minutes from now, we're going to get the Supreme Court decision on birthright citizenship. And when we do, we'll be back on the air as soon as that happens. Meantime, our coverage will continue on our streaming channel, CBS News 24/7, on your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. Many of you will now return to CBS Mornings. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Tony DeCopel in New York.
right, so you've been watching a special report. Just to remind you, the Supreme Court just issued a ruling upholding states' rights to ban transgender athletes on women and girls sports teams. But we're still waiting on a few other major cases. So for right now, we're going to dig a little bit more into this transgender ruling. Rebecca Royfee, CBS News legal contributor, is back with us. So we were obviously all just listening to that conversation. I want to read a little bit of the opinion here. It says, when analyzing the relationship between the classification based on biological sex and the asserted interest, the sports context is again crucial. And it goes on to say, in the sports context, by contrast, everyone agrees that the states may maintain separate women's and men's teams. In other words, that the states may make distinction based on sex because of the inherent physical differences between women and men. So I guess reading that, my question to you is, how much of this decision came down to the fact that sports is kind of a zero-sum game, and that there really is, Vlad and I aren't going to necessarily be able to have the same impact in a particular sport.
Right. I mean, I think that the court is really focused on exactly that, which is, every biological male who is competing in a sport with, with females is taking some spot away, taking something away from one of those women. And so I think that has a lot to do with this opinion, and I think it's written in a fairly narrow way. And I also think that's why the more liberal justices are concurring in part and dissenting in part. And I haven't actually parsed fully yet where their opinions are agreeing and where they're disagreeing, but I think that's fundamental, because I think what they're doing is teeing up these future cases and trying to buttress some arguments on behalf of the trans community in other contexts by agreeing with certain parts of the opinion that wouldn't be harmful in other areas, while maybe disagreeing with some of the others that could be more precedential, like something that could be used in a future case.
So, Rebecca, the majority, it seems, declined to decide. This is the issue that I think we're sort of getting at here, whether transgender status, A, warrants heightened protection, constitutional protection. And it says that the ruling is based not on transgender status, but biological sex, which is the distinction here that we're talking about. And in her dissent, Sotomayor says that she's accusing the majority of having a diminished view of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, that she would have rather sent this back down for what she's calling fact-finding. Break those two sort of competing thoughts for me.
Right. So, basically, you have a different level of scrutiny. Like, you examine a law based on a different kind of attitude. You're more searching and more demanding when there are certain kinds of protected classes. And what the court said here is, we don't have to determine at this point whether the trans community qualifies for this extra kind of protection or not, because these laws would fail no matter what. Would survive no matter what. Oh. That even if we were to say, okay, the trans community is a protected class, and we had to apply the more serious kind of scrutiny to this law, it would pass, because the interest in girls' sports, in girls having a competitive chance in sports, is so strong, and that these laws are related to achieving those government goals. So we don't have to decide at this point, and that just kicks the can down the road for some other context, like, if it comes up in the military or some other context where we might have to decide that opinion. And so I think what Justice Sotomayor is doing, in her opinion, and again, I have only been able to read sort of pieces of it, that essentially what she wants to do is to say the equal protection question, as opposed to the statutory question, is one that we need to look more carefully at these individual cases, and we should have decided based on these individual cases. We don't have to always say what we were saying earlier, which is like, it's a zero-sum game. Maybe it's not, right? Maybe there's some situations in which somebody who's undergone some kind of transition really doesn't have a competitive advantage over somebody else. And these are questions that are important in her mind, and that we don't have enough data in these particular cases to decide.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece of this, that if someone earlier on in their life had taken those blockers? You know, how does that meaningfully change their ability to compete in sports versus just going back to this biological sex definition? I also want to mention some of the images that we were just showing. There are protesters outside the Supreme Court right now. You can see them there, as always expected in some of these major moments like this. I do want to bring in CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. So, Ed, I mean, this isn't one of the ones that focuses on presidential power, but it certainly is something that the president has been very focused on and came up a lot during his campaign about protecting women in women's sports. How do you think all of this will play politically with the decision today?
Oh, it'll be seen as a political victory for sure, Kelly. This is definitely something he campaigned on in 2024. It was seen as a real galvanizing force for Republican candidates and their base voters. The president saying that he would push to ensure the Supreme Court did essentially what it's done, allow the states to make up these decisions for themselves. He continues pushing for other changes in transgender policy, like an outright federal ban on any money going to conversion therapy and banning such practices for minors across the country at the federal level. They've also tried to make some changes, of course, in terms of allowing transgender people to serve in the U.S. military or even paying for any ongoing surgery or medical treatment they may be receiving while they're in the ranks. So it continues on a broad spectrum. But in this case, definitely a victory seen by Republicans and those that have been pushing for restrictions. Remember, there are about 29 states that have some kind of ban in place. And so this, in essence, reinforces that. We are expecting he will weigh in later once the court announces its decision in the birthright citizenship case. And Republicans and Democrats broadly are going to have a reaction to another remaining case out there, one regarding political coordination, campaign coordination between candidates and political parties or their campaign committees, whether or not entities like the National Republican Congressional Committee can coordinate with GOP congressional candidates more and, in essence, spend more money on their behalf. Right now, there are restrictions on that. It would embolden political parties ahead of the midterms this year and certainly going forward, and is something that Republicans especially had sought. So, again, no immediate reaction, best we can tell from here. We keep our eye on Truth Social for that. And so far, just refreshing it again, no update from the president on the transgender ruling. But again, we expect something more later once the court has finished reading out its opinions. Kelly.
Ed, so the dissent in today's decision warns that this is something we've been talking about here, that this decision could extend beyond athletics. Are you hearing from your sources or from the president? Has he at all in the past suggested that it's not just women's sports that his administration is focused on, that there could be future cases involving bathrooms, for example, schools, prisons, healthcare, and notably, as Rebecca pointed out, the military?
Yeah, no, there is an absolute focus on that by this administration to try to restrict the rights of transgender people or to make it to make services less accessible to them. The other one to watch right now in the legal space is the fate of transgender troops. There's a stay that's been put in place, in essence, allowing a handful of them to continue serving. Only a few dozen were challenging the ban that was put in place by the Pentagon last year. But that is an issue that is yet to be resolved and will have to be. And I believe we have just gotten the decision here in the campaign finance coordination case. I don't know if Rebecca wants to check on that one. But that, again, looks to have gone in the direction that Republicans in the White House wanted, in essence, allowing more coordination between political parties and their candidates. One thing that was noted in Justice Kavanaugh's decision here is at the end of his remarks, there's a bit of a run there at the end regarding girls and women in sports. He is someone who has coached his own children in the Catholic League basketball in their parish here in Washington, and has great familiarity with women's athletics especially. But he makes a point at the end of his decision to point out that just because someone may be transgender and participating in sports does not necessarily mean they should be vilified by society for doing so. And so he's, in essence, asking for some grace for everyone that's been involved in this and suggesting that this should not be an opportunity for people to, in essence, pile on transgender athletes who may have been seeking broader protections or broader access to to athletic facilities or to the right to compete. So notable that he would say that in his decision, and yet we can predict where some of this may go in the coming days, given this ruling against transgender athletes.
You are correct, Ed, and just for people who are just joining us, Ed, breaking the news here on CBS News 24/7 that the Trump administration is logging another win when it comes to a case that had to do with the National Republican Senatorial Committee versus the Federal Election Commission. This is a ruling on campaign financing, and Ed, as you pointed out, the Supreme Court does appear to have ruled on that campaign finance restriction clause, and it is, again, go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, no, this is a big one. This is something that, in essence, reinforces and may actually embolden the power of political parties. Remember, there's the Democratic National Committee, there's the Republican National Committee, and then each of those entities has other committees that are responsible for electing people to the House and to the Senate. So the Republicans call theirs the NRCC and the NRSC, the DCCC, DCCC, and the DSCC. And these two entities, especially in years where it's just midterms, are raising tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, but they can't spend it directly or in coordination with candidates. Republicans had argued that they should be allowed to do that, especially in the age of super PACs, that if you're going to have these entities set up, why not allow the political parties to coordinate directly with the candidate that they are, and to advertise with or on behalf of candidates that they are nominating and supporting? Why put up that barrier? And so the big difference to anyone watching or listening right now is only this. You will continue to see political advertising digitally and on the air. What will change is the fine print at the bottom and who exactly is paying for that advertising and how much they're paying. Because the other thing that the parties had argued is when it comes to buying advertising time, say on Channel 2 in New York or Channel 7 in Los Angeles, a candidate gets to spend less money on that 30-second ad than a political party. And what this ruling is believed to now do is, in essence, lower the price for political parties to buy that advertising in coordination with the candidate, meaning broadcasters may ultimately earn less on the 30-second spot, but they may be able to sell even more of it because the purchasing power will now be there. And all this essentially means is Republicans can coordinate more closely with their most competitive or most focused on candidates. Democrats can do the same. From a political standpoint, this immediately benefits Republicans this year because while Democratic candidates are really good at raising money themselves for their campaigns, Republican candidates haven't been as good at that in more recent history, but their political organizations, the super PACs and the parties, are very good at it. So now that money can be funneled right into candidates, and it sort of eliminates the arguments about who's doing better at raising money if, in essence, you can be taking money now from your political party and don't have to just raise it yourself. So this changes potentially the contours, especially of congressional races across the country, and certainly just reinforces the power that money continues to have over our elections, especially the handful. And really, at this point, we're dealing with fewer than 24 competitive House races across the country, where now the two parties can coordinate a lot faster and spend much more on those candidates.
All right, Ed O'Keefe reporting for us from the White House. Ed, those two decisions in this morning going in the Trump administration's favor. Obviously, we'll check in with you when we get that third and final, and perhaps the one that most people are watching right now, the one having to do with the birthright citizenship in this country. So we'll get back to you, Ed. Thank you very much. So Rebecca Royfee is here in studio, our CBS News legal analyst. What's interesting here in this consequential case, which is probably the biggest one around campaign finance since the Citizens United one, Rebecca, is that Justice Kavanaugh is writing for the majority that the First Amendment protects political speech at its highest level. And the argument that he's making is that because money is often required to communicate political ideas, limiting money, in the majority's mind, limits free speech.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth kind of going back and thinking about why these limits were put there in the first place. So I think the idea is that there's a concern that there would be some kind of, that this is a prophylactic. It prevents against quid pro quo corruption. So if I'm an individual donor, there are limits on how much I could give you, for instance, as a candidate. And that's to prevent me from being, look, I'm going to give you this, huge amount of money and you're going to do this for me. And what this does is kind of a roundabout preventing me from these limits were preventing me from using the political party as a go-between. I'm going to give you this money, political party, and then you can give it to the candidate, and that way I can get what I want. And so it was a prevention against that kind of corruption, and that was the justification. And here the court said, sorry, no. Like, that's too thin a reed to rest this particular kind of limit, as Vlad said, on speech. You cannot do that because we're not convinced that it's really necessary in order to obtain that goal. Like, it doesn't seem like this is such a huge problem that people are hiding, their corruption, quid pro quo corruption. And if so, we can take care of that through some kinds of transparency rather than preventing or putting actual limits on this kind of spending.
I think about the impact here, and Ed kind of got at this a little bit as we go into a midterm election. My read on this is that it essentially favors whichever party. In theory, it is equal for both parties, but it favors the party that is able to do a better job at fundraising. And
right now, that's the Republican Party. They have more money.
Right, and I worry that as we get further and further away from what policy the candidate has, that this may just come down even more so to how much money the candidate has.
Well, that is kind of,
correctly?
but that's what Justice Kagan is sort of arguing here. She's saying that that you have now coordinated spending that functions like a contribution, and that it favors billionaires and people who, you can be transparent about it. Some billionaire gave, but it still favors the person who has more money than it does the people who do not have more money, and that political parties can sort of almost become vehicles for circumventing contribution limits.
I think that's right. I mean, it is, but we already had these, PACs that were functioning in somewhat the same way. So essentially what these rules were doing were kind of disadvantaging political parties relative to PACs. And so I don't know that the difference is really, going to affect these sort of, these questions as much as it might seem at first. I think as long as there's transparency, the real justification was not, it wasn't that this is going to help small donors or this, it really was just to prevent corruption. And I think what the court is saying here, at least as far as I've read it so far, is like we just don't, we don't see this as a huge problem, that people are hiding their quid pro quo corruption through these, intermediaries of the, of the political party. They're using.
Are you saying then, Rebecca, that because that the PACs seem to have had more power than the actual parties themselves, what the court is saying is, we're giving the political parties themselves at least equal power to the political action committees.
And that in doing that, it almost brings a level of transparency through the political parties now being able to do this versus us all just being like, well, it was this super PAC that donated, like who knows where, right?
Exactly.
I mean, they're pushing the First Amendment, at least according to the court, pushes towards the solution to these problems is transparency. The solution is not limits. The solution is not shutting things down. These sorts of campaign restrictions keep failing under the First Amendment in this court. And so the court, I think, is implicitly saying the only way that you can really manage these is through transparency, to try to make things clearer so that we can see where money is going rather than preventing money going from one place to another.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do hear that we are getting the birthright citizenship decision. We do not have the split yet. Our team is working through it, but though they struck it down is what I'm hearing from our control room team.
They struck it down?
The executive order.
The executive order.
The executive order.
Okay, the executive order.
Okay.
Very. Okay, so then if they struck it down, this executive order that Trump wanted, or the president wanted to get rid of this birthright citizenship mandate from the Constitution, I mean, was that expected? It kind of seems like from talking to you before that it was.
Yes, it was expected from the oral arguments. It was expected from the nature of this case and just how long this has been an accepted part of our constitutional culture. And so this is, essentially a loss for the president. This was a day one executive order saying that the children of illegal immigrants or people who are here on a temporary basis, even if they're born on American soil or not citizens, is unconstitutional. And so birthright citizenship is back. But, there's some interesting things that I'm looking for in this opinion, which is, was this decided on a constitutional ground or was it decided on the statutory ground? So I'm scanning through to see if we can figure that out pretty quickly. And then also, what the breakdown in votes were. I think there was, a lot of sense that Justice Thomas was going to dissent. Did Justice Alito dissent as well?
That would be very interesting, Rebecca, to see that. So for our viewers just joining us now, we've got the third and final decision from this term in the Supreme Court. This was Trump versus Barbara. The dispute concerned President Trump's executive order, as Rebecca stated, that was seeking to limit birthright citizenship for certain children born here in the United States. This happened it was the first thing that the president signed after his inauguration. He signed that executive order directing federal agencies not to recognize automatic U.S. citizenship for children born in the United States when the mother was unlawfully present and the father is neither a U.S. citizen nor a lawful permanent resident, or the mother is lawfully but temporarily present, such as on a student work visa or a tourist visa, and the father's neither a citizen or a lawful permanent resident. Multiple federal courts, as you say, Rebecca, issued nationwide injunctions that block the executive order of the president before it could take effect. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. You had that surreal moment where I think it was correct me if I'm wrong, Rebecca, the first time in history when the sitting president of the United States went to the Supreme Court to essentially stare down these justices as that argument was being made, which could be intimidating because he is the commander-in-chief and it's not a typical thing. We are going to toss to a CBS News special report, but it does appear, as Kelly said, that the executive order was struck down. Time now for a CBS News.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Tony DeCopel. The Supreme Court has just handed down a second major decision this morning, this one on birthright citizenship, long considered a right in this country. Put simply, it means that if you were born here in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. President Trump had tried to change that via executive order, arguing that children of people here illegally or temporarily are not automatic citizens. And the case had been so important to the president that he actually watched the arguments in person, the first sitting president to do that. And now we have a ruling. So let's go back to our CBS News chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford, who's reading through the ruling hot off the presses. Jan, good morning. How did the court decide?
Emphatically rejecting the president's attempt with an executive order to redefine what it means to be a citizen in this country. The idea, the long-held belief that if you're born here on U.S. soil, you're a U.S. citizen. The opinion by Chief Justice John Roberts says that the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, the Citizenship Clause, makes very clear that if you're born here, that long-held understanding that you're a U.S. citizen. The president had argued that Congress and the country had ratified that provision because it was concerned about giving citizenship to former enslaved people and their descendants, and not to the 250,000, I think, babies born here every year to people who are here illegally or temporarily. He wanted to carve that out and end that, say that citizenship would only apply to people who are here lawfully, who are domiciled here. The justices today rejecting those efforts by the president with a stroke of a pen to redefine what it means to be a citizen. This was a surprisingly narrowly divided decision, Tony. After the argument, I think a lot of us thought that it might be 7-2, that there might be more consensus around this argument. But that part of the decision, the main decision, the constitutional aspect of it, which means this closes off this issue. Congress can't come in and try to change it. That was only 5-4. With the Chief Justice, the 3 liberal justices, and Trump appointee Amy Coney Barrett agreeing that the Constitution foreclosed this option for the president or Congress. Now, Justice Kavanaugh has a dissenting opinion, and he agrees that a separate federal law could apply here, but he is not going along with the Constitution, with the court on the constitutional issue. The 3 more conservative justices are all in dissent. So, again, 5-4 on the constitutional issue, 6-3, it looks like, with the statute. And again, I'm trying to do the math. We're going to go back and read through some of these dissents right now. But the 3 conservatives, the most conservative justices, Thomas, Alito, and Justice Gorsuch, also in a sharp dissent, Tony.
All right, Jan, I'll let you go back into the text. And meanwhile, I'll bring in Jessica Levinson, our CBS News legal contributor and Loyola law professor. Jessica, thank you for being back with us. You know, when Jan and I were talking about what could be in this decision ahead of time, we talked about whether they would rule on the constitutionality or they would go to statute, federal law. It seems like they went further, going to the constitutionality. Is that a stronger rejection than anticipated?
Maybe not than anticipated, but it certainly is a stronger rejection, because what a majority of the court is saying is that Congress cannot go along with what President Trump tried to do by executive order on his first day. So it's foreclosing the ability of Congress to try and redefine birthright citizenship. A decision based on the Constitution means there's really only two things that could change the court's current understanding. And again, what's that understanding? If you're born on U.S. soil, you are a U.S. citizen. We don't look at the status of your parents. We don't look if they're here legally or illegally. We don't look to see if they're here temporarily or not. So what does it mean to have a constitutional decision? It means, again, there's two ways to change it. The court can change its mind later, can overrule itself, or there can be a constitutional amendment. But it forecloses the ability for Congress to say, you know, we think there's something in there. We like what the president did by executive order. Let's now adopt that.
Jessica, thank you very much. I want to turn now to our chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett. Major, during oral arguments back in April on this case, there was a notable exchange between John Roberts and the attorney representing Sauer, representing the United States. He said it's a whole new world, and John Roberts said, yeah, but it's the same old Constitution.
Precisely. And what President Trump has tried to do is take what was many years ago a fringy novel theory that what the 14th Amendment said did not apply to people who were in this country without documentation or temporarily, because they were not subject to the jurisdiction of our country in the way enslaved people were in 1868 when the 14th Amendment was ratified, or in 1940 when Congress put a legal statute around that general idea. And when you become president of the United States, Tony, you can take what were novel and fringe theories and make them an issue before the Supreme Court. And President Trump has done precisely that under the broad umbrella of strong political support for his restrictive immigration policies, both at the border and internally. This is a direct outgrowth of that entire philosophy that this country needs a stricter set of attitudes and legal application of its existing immigration law, and where that law doesn't exist, perhaps it needs a redefinition of it. And President Trump tried to redefine what the Constitution meant in 1868 and what a subsequent federal law meant. He was unsuccessful in that, but it nevertheless goes to the underlying and long-running political potency for this president, and before that, a candidate, Donald Trump, and the broad issue of immigration in this country.
Major, thank you. Let's turn to senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Ed, you know, after the president lost his big tariff case, he went on quite a tear on social media. This was another very important political matter to him. Do we expect to hear from him today?
Well, we've already been hearing from him ever since that tariff ruling, in essence channeling his expectation that he would lose this case, and it contributed to his ongoing strident criticism of justices who rule against the moves that he's tried to make, especially some of those that he helped put on the bench at all. We have not yet heard from the president on this. We expect to at some point later today. But we should point out, and this is somewhat to Major's point, while 7 in 10, more than 7 in 10 Americans support keeping birthright citizenship in place, what the president was acting on, in essence, is CBS News polling that finds that 51% of Republicans at the time this poll was taken wanted other requirements added to become a United States citizen, in essence believing that birthright citizenship alone, or that you were born in this country because your parents decided to make sure you were, should not be qualification enough. So he did pick this fight on day one of his second term. You'll recall that night he came back from the inaugural parade. He went to the Oval Office. Among other things, he pardoned thousands of people who had been charged or convicted in crimes related to January 6th. He also signed this executive order, in essence picking the fight with the Supreme Court and starting the clock on a constitutional argument that he made, that this was unconstitutional. And, of course, the justices today soundly rejecting that. So this is the biggest symbolic and political defeat for him next to the tariff decision this term. But given the other ways in which presidential power or Republican orthodoxy has been reinforced by this conservative court, ultimately the White House may try to spin this term at least, as a bit of a victory. The Justice Department just a little while ago, Tony, has weighed in, thanking the court for ruling in its favor in the transgender athletes case that was decided a little while ago, or announced just a little while ago. And of course, presidential powers were expanded yesterday by allowing a president to fire the heads of various independent regulatory agencies. But on this one, the president has been anticipating a loss for months, and a loss he indeed got in this case. Tony.
All right, Ed, thank you very much. Let's go back to our CBS News chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford. Jan, again, you had a few more minutes to process this. What stands out?
Well, I'm just looking at some of the language in the dissent, which, to Ed's point, we may hear the president pick up on today. Justice Alito saying this is one of the most important decisions in the history of the court, and in my judgment, the court has made a serious mistake. Conferring citizenship, interpreting the 14th Amendment on virtually everyone who happens to be born in this country, including the children of birth tourists. Justice Alito, a sharp dissent to this majority decision. You know, and when we think about the term that President Trump has had, this is the last day and this is the last case of this term. It has been, as Ed said, a mixed bag for the president. Of course, he got 2 wins last week on his immigration policy, but those were based on federal law. Congress can change those laws. Those aren't necessarily permanent victories for the president. He got more power yesterday to replace members of executive agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, but that also gives a subsequent Democratic president the power to replace all of his people. His 2 signature, potentially what he believed were his 2 signature policies on immigration and on the economy, birthright citizenship and tariffs, he lost. And he lost because some of the members of the court that he appointed ruled against him. And that's something I expect we're going to hear a lot of from the president today, who has complained that justices owe the president a duty of loyalty. This court does not believe that. That is not proper. This court interprets the law. And as Justice Gorsuch told me in our interview last month, the duty of a justice is to the Constitution. And I think that's what we're going to see a lot of the debate on today, Tony.
All right, Jan, thank you very much. Again, for our viewers, if you're just joining us, the Supreme Court has struck down the president's executive order attempting to end birthright citizenship. Chief Justice John Roberts writing in part, citizenship then and now was the right to have rights to freely participate in our political community. The framers of the 14th Amendment extended that promise to, quote, every free-born person in this land. We keep that promise today. Our coverage will continue on our streaming channel, CBS News 24/7, on your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. Many of you will now return to CBS Mornings. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Tony DeCopeland.
All right, you've been watching a special report. The Supreme Court just issued their final rulings for the term, and moments ago, a major loss for President Trump. The justices struck down president's executive order attempting to end birthright citizenship. So let's bring in CBS News legal contributor Rebecca Roiphe again. I guess high level, does this now move to constitutional amendment politics if you were to try and actually get forth what the president was trying to do?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the argument that this is bad policy, to the extent that anybody believes that it's bad policy, is not going to sway the court. This is a court that is wedded to an originalist approach. The idea was this amendment was enacted directly as a response to the Dred Scott case, and that it meant what it said, which is that if you're born on American soil, then you are a citizen. I think it's interesting because I think, Trump, in his Trump fashion, went big. He didn't say, okay, if you're here on a temporary tourist visa, then you're, he didn't try to chip away at this right. He tried to eliminate it entirely. And then he confronts what this, what was actually meant when the Constitution was amended after the Civil War. And I think, that overwhelmingly, even though he had, there were, some good lawyers there trying to present a counter case, I think the court writes an originalist opinion. It cites sources from the time at which this amendment was adopted, and holds pretty clearly that it meant what it said.
So let's bring in, along with Rebecca, lawyer and Columbia Law School professor Alora Mukherjee, who's joining us now to talk more about this. Alora, you just heard my colleague Tony DeCopel and also Rebecca mention how Justice Roberts, in closing his opinion, says that the citizenship then and now was the right to have rights, to freely participate in our political community. The framers of the 14th Amendment extended that promise to every free person born in this land. What I sort of appreciate about what Justice Roberts is referencing there is not just, as Rebecca says, the decision to overturn the Dred Scott versus Sanford case and guarantee citizenship to everyone born in the United States, but the phrase that he uses, the right to have rights, which is often associated with the political philosopher Hannah Arendt, which is the idea that citizenship in this country is a gateway to every other constitutional protection that we all have. Help me understand that for our larger audience.
Absolutely. So the right to have rights allows people to participate in federal elections, allows people to have a safe life in the United States, allows people to send their children to school here, allows people to build a life. And that is so important and reaffirmed by the Chief Justice's opinion here. It's important to note that birthright citizenship is embedded in the U.S. Constitution. It's principle has been reaffirmed by over a century of case law from the U.S. Supreme Court. There are 2 federal statutes on point. There are decades of executive branch practice, and generations of Americans have relied on birthright citizenship. So today's Supreme Court decision is a strong rebuke of the president's executive order.
And so, I mean, play out the implications here. What are the implications for mixed status families right now? I mean, are we looking at a situation where this decision now sort of stands and goes forward, or could you have states chip away at certain restrictions or resources, particularly for those folks that are born to undocumented parents?
Today's opinion is critically important, especially for those families who are expecting babies right now. I'm working with asylum seekers, with those who are here on student visas and professional visas that are temporary, who are currently expecting to deliver babies this summer. And they have been so scared and worried about what the Supreme Court would do today. Today's opinion brings them relief and joy because their babies will be U.S. citizens and will be able to stay in this country safely. For mixed status families, they are not out of danger. The president's mass deportation agenda will continue to put those who are undocumented and those who have temporary status, including temporary protected status, at risk of arrest, detention, and deportation. In terms of benefits, states are prohibited under the federal Constitution from discriminating on the basis of nationality or discriminating on the basis of citizenship. That doesn't mean that states won't try those techniques.
All right, Eleanor, stand by. Rebecca, stand by. I want to bring in renowned presidential historian and author Douglas Brinkley. He's currently the humanities chair and a professor of history at Rice University. Professor, before we talk about just how broad the powers of the presidency have expanded under the term of this Supreme Court, I just want to take a moment as we prepare to celebrate our 250th birthday to talk about this ruling that we've just all been talking about. The opinion when it comes to this birthright citizenship case repeatedly invokes Dred Scott, the slave, Abraham Lincoln, our 16th and greatest president, Frederick Douglass, one of our greatest civil rights champions, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Remind us once again why the 14th Amendment wasn't just simply a legal amendment in this country, but part of the second founding of this republic.
Well, I like the way you frame that because it really was the second founding. I mean, right now with America 250, we're talking a lot about the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution, but they have things in them that have to evolve over time. I mean, in the Dred Scott case, this was game-changing, the 14th Amendment, and that it has to hold It is the birthright. If you're born in America, you're an American citizen, and it applies to all. What was radical was President Trump throwing, I think, willy-nilly and full of hubris, an executive order on day one saying, basically, we're going to trash the 14th Amendment. That may have scored political points with him for his base, but the problem with executive orders, you can sign them and you get a lot of media headlines. But once the courts get going, and sometimes takes a year or 2 years, they could all be thrown out. And so, our first presidents really didn't use. George Washington only used a couple of executive orders. Big one for neutrality with Europe. Abraham Lincoln had a big one with the Emancipation Proclamation. That was an executive order. It's in the 20th and 21st century, presidents wanting to circumvent Congress and take an idea that's just near and dear to their hearts. They'll do what you see President Trump do. And in the end, you're back to ground zero again. I mean, the news is Dred Scott's decision mattered, and it still does. It's the second revolution in many ways. And all this is a reconfirmation that the 14th Amendment is alive and well in the United States, and it's really the backbone of who we are as a people.
I want your help taking a 30,000-foot view. We've just come to the end of the Supreme Court's term. A lot of impactful cases have been decided. I think about in the past week alone, there were cases that expanded the president's power. I'm thinking about the temporary protected status case. I'm thinking about Trump v. Slaughter regarding the FTC commissioner. This one today about birthright citizenship, certainly not expanding, limiting in that case. But what would be your assessment? How has presidential power changed in this term, and what implications does that have for future presidencies, Democratic or Republican?
Well, Trump v. Slaughter is a big win for Donald Trump. I mean, it's a win for the maximalist approach to presidential power, and it's another indication of the incredibly shrinking powers of Congress. What makes this so jarring, it's been 91 years, it's really since 1935 that we have this regulatory structure. So if you're at the National Labor Relations Board, say, the idea was that it's a watchdog agency that's always there to make sure that workers' rights aren't being abused by employers or unions. Well, now it doesn't matter. A president can come in and just wipe the board off of regulators and put personal cronies or corporate insiders in. So I think who took a hit on this? It's a big win for people that believe in increasing presidential power, but environmental groups, labor groups, healthcare groups, people in need. I mean, it's sort of a smashing of what came out of the long 60s of Ralph Nader, consumer activism and consumer rights, and it's gone. And so I think in this case, President Trump can ballyhoo a big win for what he thinks the U.S. government should be, which is the more power a president has, the better. After all, President Trump has long said he believed in what Richard Nixon said: if the president does it, it must be legal. So that one's a big feather in his cap. But I think this was really a non-starter on birthright citizenship. But I'm glad to see the Supreme Court did the obvious right thing and hold that up.
All right. Doug Brinkley, really appreciate you being on with us, as well as Rebecca Roife and Alora Mukherjee, to break down what was a historic day and has been a historic Supreme Court term.
It has indeed, and also our thanks to Ed O'Keefe, who joined us from the White House. We do, I think Eric, our producer, just told us that the president has already weighed in, celebrating the win on transgender athletes.
That's right.
He's already put out a Truth Social tweet there. And all of these cases that were decided today, yesterday, and in fact throughout the court's term this year were consequential, but there is something. The fact that I think Rebecca and Alora and Douglas Brinkley reaffirmed this, that now the Supreme Court has once again reaffirmed who is an American citizen, and it means that if there is to be a challenge again to this, it would have to come from Congress. You would have to amend the Constitution of the United States for that to change. So there is that today. That does it for us. Stay right where you are. Mugo Diwe is joining us live from San Francisco right now with our top stories. Mugo.
All right, thanks, guys. Have a good day. Let's stay with all that breaking news out of the Supreme Court today, including major decisions on birthright citizenship and the rights of transgender athletes. Let's get right to CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford in Washington for us today. Jan, good to see you. First off, let's just start with the birthright citizenship case. Your takeaways from that decision.
Well, I mean, it was written by the Chief Justice, and it got kind of crossing ideological lines. Justice Barrett and 3 of the liberal justices joining to say that the president just does not have the authority to redefine what it means to be a citizen in this country with the stroke of a pen by an executive order, because the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, the Citizenship Clause, defines what that means. And that's our long-held belief, that if you're born in this country on U.S. soil, that you're a U.S. citizen. Of course, President Trump, with that executive order that he signed on Inauguration Day, said that, immigration and illegal immigration was a lot different now than it was, and that, while maybe the Constitution, people it thought that it had this broader meaning that really should just apply to the formerly enslaved people and their descendants. That was the purpose of it, and not to people who are here undocumented or temporarily, or even for birth tourism. Again, the court really firmly rejecting that argument and closing it off, saying that the Constitution is clear. I was a little surprised that the case was as close as it was. Justice Kavanaugh joined in another part of the opinion, not the main constitutional part of the holding, and we had 3 justices, conservative justices, in dissent. So I thought after the argument it wasn't quite clear how many were going to be in dissent on that. So there were the 3 staunchest conservatives, and I'm sure the president will be quoting from some of the language of some of those dissents. But in his opinion, for the majority, the Chief Justice really just resounding language, stirring language, talking about the purpose of citizenship and what it means to be a citizen in this country, and that they are not going to disturb that long-held belief.
Yeah, and the other major ruling upholds states' ban on transgender athletes in women's and also girls' sports. So what did the court rule here, and what was ultimately left undecided?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is obviously the last day of what's been a momentous term, and we got 2 of the biggest cases, right on the very last day. That social issue case that has deeply divided the states and this country and our politics, whether or not states can ban transgender athletes from participating in women's sports, whether in middle school, high school, or college. It was a case involving laws from Idaho and West Virginia that banned transgender athletes, and then, of course, some challenged that. 27 states have these bans, more than half. 2 others ban it by policy. And today, the court said that those bans did not violate the Constitution or federal law, Title IX, that landmark legislation from 1972 that really leveled the playing field for girls' sports, that states were free to ban transgender athletes from participating in girls' sports if that's what they chose to do. Now, other states, of course, like California, New York, and others, allow transgender athletes to participate, and they can continue to do that. The court made clear that they're not addressing those states. There's been some lawsuits challenging that participation. They're not deciding that issue. They're going to allow those states to continue to allow transgender participation. But the states that want to do it, the court said it's entirely reasonable.
And do you think this case just really comes down to states having the power to make certain decisions as opposed to the federal government?
Well, not quite, but it is similar to how they decided the last major transgender case last year on whether or not states could ban so-called gender-affirming care, puberty blockers, and hormone treatments for minors. They kind of left that up to the states and allowed some of those bans to remain in place. But here they're saying that there's nothing in the Constitution or in a federal law that seems to prohibit it now. But they're leaving open other things. It's a narrow ruling that's very focused on sports. They're leaving open other areas of the law, for example, passports. I mean, some of the things that we've obviously seen debated recently for transgender rights. They're not ruling on that. It's very focused on sports.
And then finally, the High Court also struck down federal limits on campaign financing. First, I'm sort of curious what this really means. So can you break down what this ultimately means when it comes to politics? I mean, the midterms are just around the corner. How does this change anything?
Well, it's going to really, I think, kind of embolden political parties. And you're going to see, and Democrats and Republicans took different positions on this. Republicans were kind of pushing for the political parties to be able to coordinate their expenditures with the candidates. Democrats were arguing against that. The court today said that any restrictions on those kind of coordinated expenditures that political parties would want to do, well, that violates the First Amendment. That's obviously an argument we saw some of the justices thinking that some of their other rulings may have really weakened the political parties and led to an explosion of some of these like dark money PACs and super PACs. And so there is some argument that it may kind of restore some of that power back to the political parties. But again, like with everything, Mugo, this seems to be divided again. You know, the Democrats were on one side and Republicans were on the other. And I agree with you that it will have an impact on the midterms. And many people suggest that right now, because of the way the mechanisms are placed and how the different parties raise money right now, it may end up benefiting Republicans in the short term.
Okay, Dan Crawford, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it. And now let's bring in CBS News legal contributor Rebecca Roiphe. Rebecca, thanks for your time as well. So what stands out to you from today's rulings? Is this a legal fight over? Of course, we're talking about the birthright citizenship case.
Right. I mean, I think this is a very important decision. It's an originalist decision that focuses on the text of the Constitution and its meaning when that amendment was adopted. It is a strong constitutional decision which basically ends the conversation about changing birthright citizenship or eliminating birthright citizenship unless there were a constitutional amendment, which is, as you know, like notoriously hard. And so, you know, I think it is, even though expected, an extremely important decision.
And were you surprised at all by, I mean, Jan was talking about how she thought there'd be more people or more justices for this as opposed to against it, as in she just expected to see more justices who were going to say, no, we're going to strike down that executive order. But instead, there were actually a few more who were willing to keep it in place. Was that surprising to you?
You know, I think the opinion is broken down on a lot of different points. So there are different justices who are dissenting on different points. But yes, I mean, you know, I think that this was something that was just really off the table. Nobody really thought of this as a live issue for the judiciary to decide, you know, just several years ago. And so I think it does show just how aggressive the legal arguments have been and successful in certain ways. That, you know, there were counter arguments about the meaning of this amendment that were not frivolous, and that there were certain justices that were really took those seriously and accepted them and adopted them in particular ways. So while, you know, that doesn't have any impact because those are dissents for this particular issue, I do think it indicates that this is a Supreme Court that is willing to take you know, somewhat radical positions in certain circumstances seriously.
Yeah, and then your take, what is your take on the impact of the ruling on transgender athletes?
I think it's a fairly narrow ruling that really has to do with sports and athletics and the nature of female sports, both at the you know, primary school level and at the college level. And you know, so I don't know where this goes more broadly because there are two different directions that could be taken. You know, it could be that there could be some challenge to the states that have mandated that trans people be allowed in female sports. Will those statutes be upheld? And you know, then there are of course questions about people who are, you know, biological males who are, you know, in different contexts seeking protection. And I think that, we may have hints in this opinion about where the Supreme Court is going to go, but we definitely do not have answers. And I think that the Supreme Court was very clear about limiting its language to this particular context, a context that it found, I think, a lot less difficult than it would in other ways, because it didn't say, for instance, this is the status that we treat people who are, who identify as female. We give them this protected status. Instead, it said, no matter what, these laws banning biological males in female sports would be upheld because they're justified by fairness in sports. And so that, the way that it's reasoned really makes it a very narrow decision in certain ways.
Okay. Rebecca Roifi, appreciate your insight. Thank you so much. And now to CBS News correspondent Natalie Brand with reaction from the White House. Natalie, good to see you. So have we heard from the president about today's decisions from the Supreme Court?
We've heard on the two cases that went favorably toward the administration. We have not heard yet the president's latest reaction to the decision striking down his executive order trying to get rid of automatic birthright citizenship. So we are awaiting that. But, we do know that in his public statements ahead of today and the ruling, he kind of seemed prepared for the court to rule against him on that huge monumental case, particularly after oral arguments, which, remember, he was in the high court that day to listen in person to those oral arguments. And, from all the legal analysis after that, a lot of people were saying this is not looking good for the administration. Now, you are seeing a social media post on one of the cases that did go the president's way, the ruling on transgender athletes. And for that case, he said, big win. The United States Supreme Court just ruled against men playing in women's sports. That takes a ridiculous situation off the table. This is an issue that we know the president has talked about at great length, while he's in the White House and on the campaign trail, if you think back to 2024 campaign season. And then he also released a statement on social media on the campaign spending case, saying the Supreme Court just took restrictions off political spending, a big win for Republicans. This was a case that the Supreme Court ruled that candidates can now better coordinate with political parties in campaign spending. So again, the president touting these two cases. We'll wait and see what he says on birthright citizenship. I do want to point out that earlier, ahead of today's rulings, he did post on social media a link to an article suggesting that even without the Supreme Court, Congress could potentially take action to limit birthright citizenship. But the Supreme Court, from what we understand in this ruling, made clear that Congress cannot do that. The court, according to legal analysts, kind of foreclosed on that option. Mugo.
And Natalie, of course, as we talk about all this, we also have to talk about the other big story, which is this war with Iran. We know U.S. envoys are in Qatar today for talks, right? But are they directly negotiating with Iranian officials? Who are they talking to?
So from what we understand, they are speaking to Qatari mediators. So not direct negotiations with Iran's delegation, but rather one of the Middle East allies who's been trying to help mediate and de-escalate the tensions behind the scenes. And we know this comes after, new flare-ups and tension in the Strait of Hormuz. That is an issue, of course, of great significance to these Middle East partners. So that is expected to be, on the table, as well as the larger memorandum of understanding and, the tensions between Israel and Iran-backed Hezbollah in Lebanon. That said, a Qatari official said that the technical talks between the U.S. and Iran are continuing behind the scenes, since we are now in this 60-day window that started really with those negotiations in person in Switzerland. But today, to try to de-escalate these tensions, and remember the president had said that Iran requested this meeting, Qatar is saying that, this is with the mediators, that there's not a high-level Iranian delegation present at this point.
Okay, Natalie Brand at the White House for us today. Thank you so much. And still ahead, we are keeping an eye on the Colorado primary election, the battle for power, and what's at stake in the state. Plus, wildfires break out in Colorado. Some cautious optimism from officials as conditions may be changing in their favor to fight the flames. And rescue efforts continue in Venezuela after last week's deadly back-to-back earthquakes. Our Camila Montoya Galvez is on the ground, embedded with some of the American first responders who raced to find victims. I'm Mugo Odigwe. This is CBS News 24/7. We'll be right back.
The only way to get a 360-degree understanding of America is to get out there in America. There really is no swing at all when it comes to the priorities of everyday people. We care about how secure our job is, whether we can plan on retiring with dignity, whether our kids can have a brighter future than we have today. These are the fundamentals of American life, and I think they can be again.
Why doesn't he tell Republicans, come into my office, let's hammer this thing out?
Margaret, it's a totally fair question.
Politics isn't a game. Why are you opposed to this deployment?
It's unconstitutional.
Politics is about policy. I'm a voracious consumer of information, and I'm impatient. I don't like to be spun. To be moderator of Face the Nation means bringing the most powerful stakeholders to the table to become better informed.
We don't want to accept that there's evil that walks amongst us, but it does.
You know how when you meet somebody, you can't put your finger on it, but something's not right?
You never know what anybody is capable of.
I am a serial killer who's only killed once.
Did you think when this goes public, this town's going to be shocked?
Absolutely.
When you're dealing with a 30-year-old cold case, it seems like there's not a lot of hope.
We knew there was a monster out there, and we were going to find him and get him.
Look at him just coming around the corner like that.
We started tracking the area.
When did this accident scene become a crime scene?
Police!
You called him a lying liar who lies about lying.
Do you know why we're stopping you today?
What makes you so sure that you stabbed your sister while you were sleepwalking?
I never got a chance to see her one last time.
Such injustice. I can't believe they did this to her.
But no matter how hard it gets, never give up.
I'm Natalie Morales with 48 Hours. Did you have anything to do with Joanna Hunter's death?
This is a family that just wants justice.
I'm Tony DeCopel from a region at war tonight.
To tell the story,
Hello up there.
you have to be there, seeing it firsthand.
I'm Tony. I work for CBS.
Can you clarify what this war is about? How do you avoid this becoming a death trap?
This war only seems to be accelerating.
The CBS Evening News with Tony DeCopel.
Welcome back. A manhunt is underway this morning for the attacker behind an explosion at a residential building in Monaco. 3 people were seriously injured in the blast Monday night. It happened around 9 p.m. at the entrance of the residence. 2 adults and a child were rushed to hospitals. Officials believe the attacker fled to France. Both France and Monaco authorities are investigating, or assisting, I should say, in the investigation. President Trump says he will nominate Keith Sunderland to be the permanent labor secretary. Sunderland has been in the role in an active capacity since the previous secretary, Lori Chavez-Dreamer, left back in April. She had come under scrutiny over reports that her conduct was under investigation. President Trump posted online that Sunderland will, quote, do an incredible job in his new role. He still needs Senate approval before officially taking on the position. President Trump signed a memo on Monday making it easier for Americans to repair their own vehicles. Now, typically, federal law prohibits tampering with emissions control system, and car makers have put limits on some repair information and specialized tools. Critics say those limits restrict consumer choice. Now, under the new memo, the EPA will be directed to give guidance about what actions individuals can take to fix their own vehicle's emissions system. Okay, today is primary election day in the state of Colorado, and there is a race to replace term-limited Democratic Governor Jared Polis. U.S. Senator Michael Bennet and State Attorney General Phil Weiser are vying for the Democratic nomination, and the winner will face off against one of these three Republican candidates in November: State Representative Scott Bottoms, State Senator Barbara Kirkmeyer, and Pastor and Marine Corps veteran Victor Marks. Plus, a Democratic Socialist is challenging 15-term incumbent Congresswoman Diana DeGette in Colorado's 1st Congressional District. CBS News Congressional correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns is live on Capitol Hill for us today. Caitlin, thanks for your time. So tell us more about this congressional race.
Hey, Mugo, it's great to see you. This congressional race is so interesting to watch, Mugo, because we've been following the rise of the Democratic Socialist candidates and their success in a lot of these primaries. But those primaries have been largely on the East Coast and on the West Coast. And this is going to be the first test of whether that translates towards the West. Now, this is an area, a district that's in Denver, Colorado, so a very blue, progressive district. But Mugo, this is so fascinating because you have Diana DeGette, who has been in Congress for 15 terms, facing off against a challenger named Malat Kairos. And this is what you should pay attention to. Kairos was born in 1997, which was the year that DeGette took office. So DeGette has been in office as long as her challenger has been alive. And that is kind of the undercurrent here, this push for change within the Democratic Party, generational change, ideological change, and that is all coming to a head in this primary today. And now if DeGette loses this primary, she will join a long list of incumbents this cycle from both parties that have lost their bid for re-election to a challenger within their own party.
Wow, that's definitely a race to watch. And what should we know about the governor's race there in Colorado?
Yeah, this is one to watch as well, because as you mentioned, Polis, this is to take over, to succeed him. This is a race where Michael Bennet, who is a longtime senator up here, was hoping that his name ID, his ability to win statewide over a few terms would translate to the governor's race. And he's having a little bit of a hard time. He's competing against the state attorney general who you mentioned there. So this will be kind of a big test of incumbency as well. Not incumbency in this particular position, but whether he was able to kind of translate his Senate experience to the governor's race there. That looks like an uphill climb, but we will see the outcome of that race. If Michael Bennet does not persist in this primary, however, he still has his Senate seat up here. He's not up for re-election for a little bit.
Okay, Caitlin Huey-Burns on Capitol Hill. Thank you so much. The search for survivors in Venezuela is now in its 6th day. New video shows